Twinkies of the world unite. Paul Krugman somehow managed to use the Hostess debacle to call for a 91% tax rate like in the 1950s. How did he manage to do this? I'm Allen Barton. Stand by for the front page. Joining me on set, KABC radio host John Phillips and Rituparna Basu, a research associate with the Ayn Rand Center for Individual Rights. All right, so our favorite New York Times resident economist, Nobel Prize winner, and all-round celestial being, Paul Krugman, wrote a column this week called the Twinkie Manifesto and somehow managed to link the Hostess bankruptcy with proof that we need higher taxes on the rich. Really? No, he did this. Krugman writes, in the 50s, the Twinkie era, they do offer lessons that remain relevant in the 21st century. Above all, the success of the post-war American economy demonstrates that, contrary to today's conservative orthodoxy, you can have prosperity without demeaning workers and coddling the rich. All right, John, we'll start with you on this one. This was a bizarre article, utterly without irony and without mentioning anything about the actual circumstances of the Hostess bankruptcy or why it's going bankrupt or what's going on there. He somehow managed to allude to some beautiful era in the 1950s when we had a 91% tax rate and company executives were sort of under siege, and this was a great thing. What do you think of what he was talking about?
Well, I had to read it twice because when I heard Paul Krugman hearkening back to the 50s, I thought he meant the 1850s because he does look like the last surviving Confederate general.
Yes, there's that too.
But what we can learn from the Hostess company is that when you run a company poorly, bad things happen. And that was a company that was run poorly. You had, I think it was 6 different executives that they had in the last 10 years. You had union work rules that were out of control. You know that if you were a driver, a truck driver, a teamster for Hostess, and you were delivering Yankee Doodles and Wonder Bread to the same Ralph's grocery store, the same Walmart, 2 trucks, because you couldn't bring the same products on one truck. You had to have separate trucks for separate products. So Dick Gephardt, by the way, was one of the consultants that they hired to write these union contracts. So when you have a company that's just run poorly from the top down, you're going to have bad results.
And that would seem to be the story that one would be discussing when discussing this week. If you're discussing anything about Hostess, you might be discussing how the company is run and why it's going bankrupt, not discussing why Hostess somehow conjures up the 50s era and how the 50s era was fabulous before its incredibly high tax rates. So let's go to Krugman's argument, if you want to call it that, which is that high taxes, federal tax rates in the 50s, there was a 91% rate on the really high earners, was a fabulous thing. Your thoughts?
Well, imagine if every dollar you earn, 90 cents of that was confiscated by the government. Would you feel that motivated to work? I don't know. I certainly would not feel motivated. And I think the purpose here is, well, he's saying, okay, in the 50s we were able to get away with this. We were able to tax people who earn a lot of money. We were able to tax up to 90% of what they earned. And we got away with this, so let's try to do it now. But that doesn't say anything about whether it was morally right to do it, right? And he says, look, nobody was going galt. He refers to Ayn Rand, he refers to Atlas Shrugged, and he says these people who were so productive, they were not distancing themselves from society. So look, it worked, we should do it again. But was it the right thing to do? I think this says more to how back then people, and still today, don't have the moral confidence to really defend that they have the right to keep what they earn. But that's not what's important. He's just saying, well, listen, we did it then, we got away with it then, let's do it now. And that kind of malice towards people who make a lot of money, who are presumably so productive, that's pretty sick.
Yeah, he makes a case for impoverished executives, and he states, squeezed between high taxes and empowered workers, executives were relatively impoverished by the standards of either earlier or later generations. Today, of course, the mansions, armies of servants, and yachts are back, bigger than ever, and any hint of policies that might crimp plutocrat style is met with cries of socialism. Surely then, the far less plutocrat-friendly environment of the 50s must have been an economic disaster, right? And he goes on to make the argument that it was not a disaster, that the country was doing well, but this, talk about ignoring context of the 50s, where the world economy was at in the 50s in relation to America, and then also relative tax rates between federal and state. estate taxes and the amount of taxation overall in the economy has skyrocketed in the last 50 years. So, John, what did you think of the context here?
Well, a better comparison would be comparing Hostess to cities and states that are going bankrupt, because you have mayors, you have governors that give the unions everything that they want, and they skim from the top and they take care of their campaign contributors, big labor and whoever it is that has their ear or provided the campaign cash for their campaign. And you have cities going bankrupt right and left. In California, we had San Bernardino, we had Stockton. Detroit in Michigan is a city that's just a carcass of a city with less population now than they had in the 1950s. I think that's the better comparison. If you want to compare a 1950s comparison to Hostess, how about Detroit?
Now, picking up on your point about the unions, because this week Hostess had to close its doors, or I guess now they're going to try to mediate, but they're in trouble. Walmart workers are threatening to strike on Black Friday, the big shopping day. Airline employees here in Los Angeles are threatening a walkout on the busiest travel day of the year. So when you look at the issue of labor unions, do you see them on the rise or on the fall? Because, Ritu, sector of population that are part of particularly private unions has declined, but do you think they're sort of feeling their oats a little bit in the current environment, that they can start to make these stands and really disrupt business and get stuff for themselves?
Well, it's definitely true, regardless of how many people are in unions now compared to the 50s. It's definitely true that unions have a lot of coercive power over employers, right? And they have the government backing them up, and that's why employers are very, very nervous about unions, and you have companies shutting down entire factories, entire plants, because the workers are saying they want to unionize. Now, unionizing by itself is not a bad thing. If you want to get together with a bunch of employees and want to collectively bargain and the employer agrees with that, that's fine. But the whole problem is when the government gets involved and gives, backs that up and says that employers can't.
Well, what's interesting is a lot of the laws and a lot of the legislation that you're seeing is going towards the mandatory union membership or the mandatory dues collection out of your paycheck that goes to the unions. And in those states, John, where they've started to limit this, you see union membership plummeting. When people actually have the option, do you want to join or not? You want to take some of your paycheck and give it to the union or not? The voluntary rate is a minuscule portion of the mandatory rate. And I think that's an interesting trend.
Well, the unions are totally out of control. And we don't live in a world where the majority of the workers belong to unions. And private sector unions are actually on the decline right now. And you'll see some cases, some instances, where you'll have the Teamsters and their interests butt up against the public employee unions. The Teamsters are actually some of the most reasonable ones in the room, if you could believe
really
that.
Public sector unions. When you look at bankruptcies going on,
yeah.
The municipal bankruptcies are all public sector unions against which FDR, he was not for it. Kennedy,
And even with Hostess, the Teamsters cut a deal. It was the bakers that didn't do it.
Yeah.
And you look at the ones that are just looking to create the biggest disruptions, the ones at LAX on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, where they want to add 90 minutes to your commute. And they're wearing this as a badge of honor, saying that, oh yes, you're going to be forced to sit there and listen to us. The janitors did this too, when they protested in the streets in Century City, where old people couldn't go to the doctors. And they look at this as a big victory. And, who knows? Maybe they're supporters, and maybe California's a left-wing Democratic state, so maybe the public looks at that and thinks it's a great thing. If I miss my flight because these people are getting in the way, I'm going to be unhappy.
Yeah. All right, well, the final question is, at the center of Paul Krugman's brain, do you think we will find a nice, delicious, cream-filled little, something in the middle there? Rita?
I think if that were the case, we wouldn't be in the trouble we're in today. I mean, this is not some fringe guy,
It would probably be better
right?
if Krugman's had a cream-filled center.
People take him seriously, and that's...
Yeah, he won a Nobel Prize. Again, wrote an article about Twinkies and Hostess and didn't mention the company or its bankruptcy. That was amazing. That's all the time we have for today. For Ritu and John, I'm Allen Barton, and you've been watching Front Page.